Hey everyone. Today we're tackling a question most people won't touch. What Messalina did to the men of the Imperial court, and why it functioned as a warning to the world. Forget the sanitized version where she's just another scheming empress in a toga. The truth is stranger, messier, and cuts straight to the bone of how power actually works when one person holds all the cards and everyone else is expendable. Picture this. Rome in the mid-1st century of the Common Era. The empire spans 3 continents. Aqueducts pump water to 1 million people. Legions garrison Britain to Syria. And at the center of it all sits a young emperor who drools, twitches, and according to hostile sources probably shouldn't be running a fishing boat, let alone an empire. His name is Claudius. He's 50 years old when he takes the throne, ancient by Roman standards for a first-time emperor. And he's married to a woman 30 years his junior named Valeria Messalina. Now, Messalina's story comes to us through some of the most hostile, sensationalist sources in all of ancient literature. We're talking Tacitus, who wrote decades after her death with a clear agenda against imperial women. We're talking Suetonius, who collected palace gossip like baseball cards. We're talking Cassius Dio, writing a century and a half later. And Juvenal, a satirist who literally made his living exaggerating vice for entertainment value. None of these men were in the room. None of them liked the people they were writing about, and all of them had political reasons to paint the Julio-Claudian dynasty as a carnival of depravity. So here's the framework we're using. We're going to examine what these sources claim, understand why they claimed it, and then dig into what those claims reveal about power, gender, and propaganda in the Roman world. Because whether or not Messalina did every single thing she's accused of, the accusations themselves are the story. They're a roadmap to how Roman elites weaponized scandal, policed female sexuality, and used the bedroom as a battlefield for political survival. And if you're here for history that refuses to sugarcoat empire and propaganda, go ahead and subscribe. We're just getting started. Messalina was born around the year 20, probably in Rome, into the highest tier of Roman nobility. Her mother was Domitia Lepida, her father Marcus Valerius Messala Barbatus. Both families were old money aristocracy, with bloodlines stretching back to the Republic. She was a second cousin to Claudius on her mother's side, and descended from Mark Antony's line as well. In other words, she wasn't some random girl who lucked into the palace. She was already plugged into the network of imperial marriages, alliances, and backroom deals that kept the Roman elite in power. When she married Claudius, she was somewhere between 14 and 16 years old. He was close to 50. Physically disabled, socially marginalized by his own family, and widely considered a joke. Ancient biographers writing decades later, often with political grudges, report that Augustus and Livia, Claudius's grandmother, openly mocked him. They kept him out of public life, worried his speech impediment and limp would embarrass the family. So for most of his life, Claudius was the imperial spare nobody wanted to use. Then in the year 41, everything changed. The Emperor Caligula, Claudius's nephew, was assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard. The palace was in chaos. The Senate was scrambling to figure out who would take power next, possibly even debating a return to Republican government. And the Praetorians, looking for someone, anyone, who could legitimize their role and keep the paychecks coming, found Claudius hiding behind a curtain. They declared him emperor on the spot. Suddenly, the man everyone ignored was running the known world. And Messalina, this teenage aristocrat married to the family embarrassment, was now Empress of Rome. Here's where the story gets interesting, and where our sources start mixing fact with politically motivated fiction. Ancient historians allege that Messalina immediately began leveraging her position in ways that shocked even the jaded Roman court. But let's be clear about what shocking meant in this context. Roman elites were not scandalized by ambition. They weren't scandalized by backroom deals, patronage networks, or the use of sex as a tool of alliance. What scandalized them, or what they claimed scandalized them, was a woman doing these things openly, without the cover of male intermediaries, and doing them so successfully that she threatened the established order. Tacitus alleges that Messalina controlled access to the emperor. She placed her allies in key positions. She accumulated wealth through confiscations and legal maneuvering. She allegedly eliminated rivals by accusing them of treason, a charge that was both vague enough to apply to almost anyone and serious enough to warrant execution. In other words, She did exactly what every other powerful Roman, male or female, did to survive in the imperial court. The difference was that she was young. She was a woman, and she was very, very good at it. Now let's talk about the bedroom allegations, because this is where the sources go from political biography to outright propaganda. Tacitus, Suetonius, and Juvenal all claim that Messalina engaged in a series of extramarital affairs, sometimes with multiple partners, sometimes in settings that ranged from the palace to allegedly, and this is where it gets absurd, a public brothel. Juvenal, writing satire, not history, spins a tale about Messalina sneaking out of the palace at night, dyeing her hair, and competing with professional sex workers under a pseudonym. Let's apply some basic source criticism here. Juvenal was a satirist. His job was exaggeration. His goal was to entertain an audience that wanted to believe the worst about imperial women. The story he tells is not evidence of what Messalina actually did. It's evidence of what Roman men found titillating and terrifying. A woman with power who refused to be controlled. But even if we dismiss the brothel story as fiction, and we should, there's still a pattern in the sources worth examining. Multiple accounts allege that Messalina had relationships with men at court, and that these relationships weren't just personal. They were political. She allegedly used sexual access as a form of patronage, rewarding loyalty and punishing disloyalty through her body as much as through her influence over Claudius. This section discusses historical allegations about private life in antiquity, no graphic detail, focus on political implications and source bias. What the sources describe, stripped of sensationalism, is a woman using every tool available to her in a system where formal political power was closed to women. She couldn't hold office. She couldn't command legions. She couldn't give speeches in the Senate. But she could control who had access to the emperor. She could reward allies and destroy enemies. And if sexuality was one of the tools in that arsenal, then from her perspective, why not use it? The men of the imperial court understood this. That's why the sources are so hysterical about it. Messalina wasn't just breaking sexual norms. She was inverting the power structure. In traditional Roman morality, men were supposed to be the active agents, women the passive recipients. A married woman's sexuality was supposed to be property, controlled by her father, then her husband, then her sons. Messalina allegedly flipped that script. She became the active agent. She chose her partners. She instrumentalized desire. And in doing so, she made the men around her, senators, equestrians, freedmen, dependent on her favor in ways that were supposed to flow the other direction. That's the warning the title refers to. Not a moral warning about lust or vice, a political warning about what happens when a woman seizes the tools of patronage in a system built to exclude her. The men of the court weren't scandalized because she had affairs. They were terrified because she was winning. Now we need to talk about who Messalina actually targeted, because the pattern matters. According to Tacitus, her victims, or her conquests, depending on how you frame it, weren't random. They were men with something she needed. Wealth, military connections, legal expertise, or simply loyalty in a palace full of potential assassins. One of the most frequently mentioned names is Gaius Silius. He was a consul designate, meaning he was on track to hold one of the two highest elected offices in Rome. He was young, wealthy, well-connected, and according to the sources, exceptionally good-looking. Tacitus alleges that Messalina became obsessed with him, and that he initially resisted her advances. But here's the thing about resisting the Empress of Rome. It's not really an option. Refusing her could be interpreted as disloyalty to the imperial house. Accepting her could be interpreted as treason against the emperor. Either way, you're dead if the winds shift. Hostile sources allege that Silius eventually gave in, not because he wanted to, necessarily, but because the alternative was worse. And once he was in Messalina's orbit, he became part of her faction. She allegedly showered him with gifts, including property confiscated from executed senators. She paraded him at public events. She made no effort to hide the relationship. In fact, the sources suggest she wanted people to know. The relationship wasn't just personal, it was a display of power. It said, "I can do this, and there's nothing you can do to stop me." But Silius wasn't the only one. Tacitus and Suetonius name others. Menestor, a famous pantomime actor who allegedly begged Claudius for protection from Messalina's advances, and was ordered by the emperor to obey her in all things. Troilus Montanus, an equestrian, Sulpellus and Poppaeus Sabinus, both men of senatorial rank. The list goes on. Some of these men were likely genuine allies or lovers. Some were probably victims of palace rumor. Some may have been fabricated entirely by later historians looking to pad their narratives. What matters is the pattern the sources are trying to establish, Messalina turning the imperial court into a web of sexual patronage, where men competed for her favor and feared her displeasure. She allegedly controlled appointments, legal decisions, and imperial policy through a combination of pillow talk with Claudius and direct relationships with the men who executed that policy. And here's the key question. Was this actually happening? Or was this how male senators and historians explained away their own participation in a corrupt system? Because if you're a senator who took bribes, manipulated trials, confiscated property, and betrayed your colleagues to advance your career, it's a lot easier to say, the empress seduced me than, I chose to do these things for power and money. Messalina becomes the scapegoat. The men stay blameless. Roman misogyny had a funny way of working. Women were simultaneously too weak to hold power and too dangerous to be left unchecked. They were irrational, emotional, controlled by their bodies, except when they were criminal masterminds manipulating the entire empire. The cognitive dissonance is the point. It allowed Roman men to have it both ways. Women were inferior and needed to be controlled, but also any time something went wrong, a woman was probably behind it. So let's talk about what Messalina actually accomplished in terms of measurable political power, because the sexual allegations are only half the story. While the sources are busy cataloging her alleged bedroom conquests, they also, almost accidentally, document her effectiveness as a political operator. She placed her allies in key positions throughout the imperial administration. Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus, three of the most powerful freedmen in Claudius's court, all had to navigate her influence. She accumulated massive personal wealth, possibly rivaling the emperor's own fortune, through a combination of inheritances, confiscations, and what we might today call insider trading. When a senator fell from favor, his property often ended up in Messalina's portfolio. She also wielded the accusation of treason like a scalpel. Tacitus records multiple instances where prominent Romans were arrested, tried, and executed on charges that suspiciously benefited Messalina's interests. Did they actually commit treason? Maybe. Probably not. But in a system where the emperor's word was law and the emperor was easily manipulated, proof didn't matter. What mattered was who had his ear at the right moment. And here's where it gets complicated. Some of the people she allegedly destroyed probably deserved it. The Roman Senate in the 1st century wasn't a council of wise statesmen nobly debating the common good. It was a nest of vipers, every one of them looking for an angle, every one of them willing to step over bodies to get ahead. If Messalina played the game ruthlessly, she was playing by the rules everyone else had already agreed to. The problem, from the Senate's perspective, was that she was better at it than they were. Tell me in the comments, when a woman uses the same ruthless tactics as the men around her, is she more corrupt than they are? Or are we just more willing to see it? But there's one particular incident that the sources dwell on, and it's worth examining in detail because it represents the moment when Messalina's power reached its peak, and also the moment when it began to collapse. I'm talking about the Silius affair, but not the sexual relationship. I'm talking about what happened next. According to Tacitus, and remember, we're dealing with a source who's writing 50 years after these events with a clear bias against imperial women. Messalina decided to marry Gaius Silius while she was still married to Claudius. Not secretly, not symbolically. She allegedly went through with an actual formal Roman marriage ceremony, complete with witnesses, religious rites, and legal documentation. Now, if this happened, and that's a big if, it's one of the most baffling political moves in Roman history. Because here's what it meant in legal terms. Absolutely nothing. You can't be married to two people at once under Roman law. Any ceremony performed while Messalina was still married to Claudius would be automatically void. It wouldn't transfer any power to Silius. It wouldn't make him emperor. It would just be theater. So why do it? Tacitus offers two explanations. The first is that Messalina was so consumed by lust and arrogance that she stopped caring about consequences. The second is that she and Silius were planning a coup, that the marriage was the first step in a plot to overthrow Claudius. and they were counting on the Praetorian Guard to back them once the deed was done. Modern historians have offered a third possibility. The whole thing never happened. Or it happened, but not the way Tacitus describes it. Maybe there was a private ceremony, a symbolic ritual that got exaggerated by rumor and hostile sources into a full legal marriage. Maybe Silius and Messalina were planning something, but it was a contingency plan in case Claudius died naturally, not an active coup. Maybe the entire story was invented after the fact to justify what happened next, because what happened next was a purge. Claudius was allegedly out of town, visiting the port of Ostia, when news of the marriage reached his freedman advisors. And here's where the story gets genuinely tragic if you believe the sources. Narcissus, one of Claudius's most trusted freedmen, allegedly rushed to the emperor and told him that his wife had married another man. Claudius, according to Tacitus, didn't believe it at first. He kept asking if he was still emperor. He kept asking if Messalina was still his wife. He seemed genuinely confused about whether any of this was real. The freedmen convinced him it was real. They convinced him it was treason. And they convinced him that the only way to survive was to strike first. The sources describe what followed as a rapid, brutal purge. Silius was arrested and executed without trial. The men associated with him, the alleged co-conspirators, the members of Messalina's faction, were rounded up and killed. Some fell on their swords. Some were beheaded. Some were strangled in prison. Tacitus gives us a body count in the dozens, though as always with ancient sources, we should take specific numbers with skepticism. And Messalina? She was trapped in the gardens of Lucullus, a massive estate on the outskirts of Rome. She allegedly tried to draft a letter begging Claudius for mercy. She allegedly tried to appeal to their children, Britannicus and Octavia, both still young. She allegedly considered fleeing the city, but by that point, the Praetorian Guard had surrounded the gardens. Tacitus gives us a death scene that's almost Shakespearean in its pathos. He describes Messalina lying in the dirt, weeping, unable to find the courage to take her own life. Her mother, Domitia Lepida, was with her, a woman who had reportedly been estranged from her daughter for years, but showed up at the end to tell her that her life was over, and the only thing left was how she chose to die. Messalina allegedly tried to stab herself, but couldn't complete the act, so a tribune of the Praetorian Guard did it for her. One thrust, through the heart. She was dead before the sun set. She was approximately 27 years old. Now here's the question we have to ask. Was Messalina actually planning a coup? Or was she the victim of a palace conspiracy that used allegations of sexual transgression to justify her murder? Because let's be very clear about what the freedmen stood to gain from her death. Narcissus, Pallas, and Callistus weren't loyal servants protecting their emperor out of the goodness of their hearts. They were power brokers in their own right, men who had amassed fortunes and influence by controlling access to Claudius. And Messalina, as the empress, was competition. She had her own networks, her own faction, her own agenda. As long as she was alive, there was a limit to how much power the freedmen could consolidate. By convincing Claudius that Messalina had committed treason, they eliminated their greatest rival and positioned themselves as the saviors of the regime. It's a classic palace coup dressed up as justice. Tacitus himself, despite his obvious bias against Messalina, seems uncomfortable with how quickly everything happened. He notes that Claudius didn't personally witness any of the alleged treason. He notes that no formal trial took place. He notes that the executions were carried out before Claudius could even verify the claims. And most damningly, he notes that Claudius, a man supposedly betrayed by his wife in the most humiliating way possible, sat down to dinner immediately after her death and asked where the empress was. That detail, if true, is devastating. It suggests that Claudius either didn't understand what had just happened or was so detached from reality that the murder of his wife barely registered. Either way, it raises serious questions about who was actually in control of the imperial court. Here's my read. Whether or not Messalina and Silius were planning anything remotely resembling a coup, the freedmen needed Claudius to believe they were. They needed him frightened, confused, and dependent on their guidance. They needed to move fast, before Messalina could defend herself or rally her own supporters. And they needed her dead, not exiled, because a living Messalina, even a disgraced one, was still dangerous. So they manufactured a crisis. They presented Claudius with a version of events so shocking, so humiliating, that he couldn't think clearly. And then they executed his wife before he had time to ask questions. It's brilliant, in a horrifying sort of way. And it's exactly the kind of move that Messalina herself was accused of pulling on her own victims. The Roman elite were shocked that a woman would use sex and scandal to manipulate men and consolidate power. And then they turned around and used accusations of sexual misconduct to execute her without trial. The irony is so thick you could build an aqueduct with it. So what's the warning? What did Messalina's story signal to the world? First, it's a warning about the limits of female power in a patriarchal system. Messalina accumulated more influence than almost any Roman woman before her. She controlled access to the emperor, manipulated appointments, destroyed rivals, and amassed a personal fortune. She did everything a male politician would do, and she did it without apology. And the moment her power threatened the established order, the moment men like Narcissus decided she was more dangerous than useful, she was eliminated. No trial, no defense, just a rapid execution disguised as justice. Second, it's a warning about how sexual morality gets weaponized in political conflicts. Notice that the charges against Messalina weren't corruption, or treason in the straightforward sense, or abuse of power. The charges were sexual, adultery, licentiousness, the marriage to Silius. Because in Roman culture, a woman's sexuality was always the weakest point in her armor. You could accuse a man of ambition, greed, cruelty, and those charges might or might not stick, but accuse a woman of sexual transgression, and the case was already half won. Her defense became impossible, because defending herself meant talking about sex, which only reinforced the idea that she was shameless. It's the same logic that runs through every society that uses sexual purity as a proxy for political legitimacy. Control a woman's sexuality, and you control her access to power. Let her sexuality become uncontrolled, or claim that it has, and you have grounds to destroy her. Third, and maybe most important, Messalina's story is a warning about propaganda. Almost everything we know about her comes from sources written by men who hated her. Decades or centuries after her death, with no incentive to be fair or accurate. They had political reasons to portray the Julio-Claudian dynasty as depraved. They had cultural reasons to portray imperial women as dangerous. And they had literary reasons to make the story as salacious as possible, because that's what sold books in the ancient world. We'll never know what Messalina actually did. We'll never know if she loved Silius, or feared him, or used him, or was used by him. We'll never know if she planned a coup or if the whole thing was a setup. We'll never know if she died defiant or broken. What we know is the story that survived. And that story tells us more about Roman anxieties than it does about Messalina herself. Let's zoom out and talk about what Messalina's story meant for the women who came after her. Less than a year after Messalina's execution, Claudius married again. His new wife was his niece, Agrippina the Younger, a woman who had watched her mother starve to death in exile, who had survived her brother Caligula's reign of terror, and who had learned every lesson Messalina's downfall had to teach. Agrippina understood that power without protection was suicide, so she didn't just marry Claudius. She maneuvered to have her son Nero adopted as Claudius's heir, displacing Britannicus, Messalina's biological son. She cultivated the Praetorian Guard. She built alliances with senators who remembered what happened to Messalina's faction. And when Claudius died, possibly of natural causes, possibly of poisoning, the sources disagree. Nero became emperor, and Agrippina became the most powerful woman in Rome, for a while. Because Agrippina's story ends the same way Messalina's did, with accusations, isolation, and execution. Her own son had her killed. The charges were the usual: ambition, interference, sexual impropriety with various men at court. Same playbook, different victim. Then there's Poppaea Sabina, Nero's second wife. Beautiful, intelligent, wealthy, and allegedly so manipulative that she convinced Nero to murder his mother. The sources, predictably, also accuse her of sexual intrigue. She dies young too, kicked to death by Nero while pregnant, if you believe Tacitus. Are you noticing a pattern? Imperial women in the 1st century keep getting accused of the same things: sexual excess, political manipulation, conspiracy, and they keep dying the same way, suddenly, violently, with no real chance to defend themselves. It's almost like the accusations are structural. Like the Roman system needed these women to fail, because their success threatened the fundamental lie that women were unfit for power. But here's the thing. They did hold power. Messalina, Agrippina, Poppaea, they weren't figureheads or decorative consorts. They shaped policy, controlled appointments, eliminated rivals, and influenced emperors who supposedly ruled the known world. The sources hate them for it, but the sources also can't deny it. So the warning isn't, women shouldn't seek power. The warning is, if you're a woman and you successfully seize power in a system designed to exclude you, that system will destroy you and rewrite your story to justify it. Now let's talk about the long game, because Messalina's influence didn't end with her death. It echoed through Roman politics for decades. Her children survived her, barely. Britannicus, her son, was sidelined in favor of Nero and eventually poisoned at a dinner party when he was 14 years old. Octavia, her daughter, was married to Nero, her own adoptive brother, in a political arrangement designed to legitimize his claim to the throne. When Nero got bored with her and wanted to marry Poppaea instead, he accused Octavia of adultery, exiled her, and then had her executed. She was 22. Both of Messalina's children died young, disgraced, and friendless. Both were victims of the same power struggles that killed their mother. And the sources, predictably, spend very little time mourning them. Britannicus gets a footnote. Octavia gets a paragraph. They're collateral damage in the larger story of imperial succession. But the precedent Messalina set, or the precedent her enemies claimed she set, became a template for how Rome understood and feared powerful women. Every empress after her was measured against the Messalina standard. Was she too ambitious? Too involved in politics? Too close to men outside her marriage? If yes, she was another Messalina, and that was all the justification needed to sideline or eliminate her. It's a rhetorical trap. If an empress stayed out of politics, she was irrelevant. If she engaged in politics, she was dangerous. The only winning move was not to play, except that not playing meant abandoning any chance at survival in a court where alliances shifted daily, and yesterday's favorite was today's corpse. Messalina understood this. She played the game as hard as she could, using every tool available to her. She lost. But she lost because the game was rigged from the start, not because she played it wrong. Let's bring this home. What's the actual historical consensus on Messalina? Stripped of the propaganda and the sensationalism, modern scholars generally agree on a few things. First, she was politically active and wielded significant influence during Claudius's reign. The evidence for this isn't just literary. We have inscriptions, legal documents, and administrative records that show her fingerprints on imperial policy. Second, she probably did have extramarital relationships, though whether those relationships were consensual, coerced, political, personal, or some combination is impossible to determine. Ancient sources treat her sexuality as scandalous, but by Roman standards, powerful men having affairs was so routine, it barely merited comment. The double standard is the point. Third, the marriage to Silius is contested. Some historians think it happened and was a genuine coup attempt. Some think it happened, but was symbolic or ceremonial, not a legal marriage. Some think it was exaggerated or fabricated by the freedmen to justify her execution. We'll probably never know for sure. Fourth, her execution was almost certainly a palace coup disguised as justice. The speed of it, the lack of a trial, the involvement of the freedmen who stood to benefit from her death, it all points to a coordinated strike designed to eliminate a rival before she could defend herself. And fifth, the sources we have are unreliable. They're hostile, sensationalist, written decades or centuries after the fact, and shaped by Roman cultural anxieties about women and power. Treating them as objective history is like treating a political attack ad as a documentary. So when we ask what Messalina did to the men of the imperial court, the honest answer is, we don't know exactly. But we know what those men claimed she did, and we know they used those claims to justify her murder. And we know that the story they told, the story of the insatiable, power-hungry empress who seduced and manipulated her way to the top, became the template for understanding all ambitious women in Roman politics. That's the warning. Not a warning about sexual morality or female virtue. A warning about how power structures use allegations of sexual transgression to destroy women who threaten them. A warning about how easily propaganda becomes history when the victims don't survive to tell their side. A warning about the cost of being a woman who refuses to stay in her lane. Messalina's story is brutal, tragic, and unresolved. And that's exactly why it matters. So where does this leave us? What do we take away from a story this messy, this contested, this wrapped in 2,000 years of bias and reinterpretation? Here's what I think. Messalina's story is less about what one woman did in the first century of the Common Era, and more about what every society does to women who accumulate power outside sanctioned channels. She wasn't unique. Powerful women before and after her faced the same accusations, the same traps, the same violent ends. Cleopatra was called a seductress who bewitched Roman generals. Agrippina was called a poisoner and manipulator. Empress Theodora in Byzantium, centuries later, was accused of being a former sex worker who corrupted the Emperor Justinian, charges that modern historians treat with heavy skepticism. The script never changes. Ambitious woman seeks power. Rumors of sexual excess emerge. Men who benefit from her downfall present themselves as moral guardians. The woman is eliminated. History records her as a cautionary tale. And the brilliance, if you can call it that, is that the system makes the accusations unfalsifiable. If a woman defends herself, she's shameless. If she stays silent, she's guilty. If she fights back, she's irrational and emotional. If she accepts her fate, she's weak. There's no winning move, because the game is designed to ensure that women lose. Messalina's mistake, if she made one, wasn't ambition or ruthlessness, or even the alleged affair with Silius. Her mistake was succeeding too visibly in a system that required women to wield power invisibly or not at all. She made enemies who couldn't tolerate a world where she had more influence than they did. And so they used the oldest trick in the book. They turned her sexuality into a weapon against her. This pattern repeats across cultures and centuries. Marie Antoinette wasn't just accused of financial extravagance. She was accused of sexual depravity and lesbianism in pamphlets designed to destroy her reputation before the guillotine destroyed her body. Anne Boleyn wasn't just charged with treason. She was charged with adultery and incest, accusations that conveniently eliminated Henry VIII's need for a costly divorce. Monica Lewinsky wasn't just a political scandal. She was turned into a national punchline. Her sexuality weaponized to destroy her credibility while the men involved faced far less scrutiny. Different contexts, same mechanism. When you can't attack a woman's ideas or competence directly, attack her sexuality. Make her the story instead of the substance. Turn her body into evidence of her unfitness for power. Messalina, whether she knew it or not, was operating in a system where this was always going to be the outcome. The only question was timing. So here's the final piece. Why does this story still matter? Why spend nearly an hour digging through hostile sources and contested scholarship about a woman who died 2,000 years ago? Because the mechanisms that killed Messalina are still running. They're more sophisticated now, sure. We don't execute women in the gardens of Lucullus anymore. But we still use sexual scandal to destroy women in public life. We still treat a woman's sexuality as disqualifying evidence when her competence becomes inconvenient. We still write histories that focus more on who she slept with than what she accomplished. And we still tell ourselves comforting lies about meritocracy and fairness, while building systems that punish women for playing the same games men play. Messalina's story is a warning because it shows how little has changed. The specific accusations evolve. We don't really care about adultery the way Romans did, but we found new ways to police women's bodies and choices. But the underlying logic remains. Women who seek power threaten the established order. Sexual allegations provide a convenient mechanism for eliminating that threat. History remembers the allegations and forgets the context. The men of the imperial court weren't warned about Messalina's sexual appetite. They were warned about what happens when a woman successfully navigates the same patronage networks, political alliances, and ruthless calculations that they used every day. They were warned that if they let one woman break the rules and get away with it, more might follow. They were warned that the system only works if everyone agrees that women can't be trusted with real power, and so they killed her. Quickly, efficiently, and with just enough salacious detail to ensure that future generations would remember her as a villain, not a victim. That's what Messalina did to the men of the imperial court. She showed them what female competence in a corrupt system looked like. She showed them that all their carefully maintained myths about women being too emotional, too weak, too irrational for politics were just that, myths. She showed them that the only thing keeping women out of power was the willingness of men to use violence to maintain that exclusion. And that was a warning they couldn't ignore. If you found this deep dive into how power, gender, and propaganda intersect in ways that echo across millennia compelling, go ahead and subscribe. There's more where this came from. Hit like if you appreciate history that doesn't shy away from uncomfortable questions. And drop a comment if you've got thoughts on how these patterns show up in modern political discourse. Because the conversation Messalina started 2,000 years ago, we're still having it. Thanks for watching.